Welcome to the CK Podcast. Our special guest today is Jackson Hoy, NBA draft writer with the Stepien and Locked Draft. My man, how are you doing? Thank you so much for coming on.
I'm doing great, Leo. Thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. You recently wrote, today, you wrote a Mikal Bridges in-depth story. Let's talk about that first. How many hours do you usually spend on these type of features?
This one, honestly, compared to some of the ones I've written, it took me a little bit less time. But this one was probably 8 to 10 hours in there on that, just between watching film, cutting up film, and then writing and putting it together. Um, the reason it took a little bit less time than some of the other film breakdowns I've done is sometimes when you're profiling a player, like I've done pieces profiling like DeAndre Hunter, Troy Brown, Zaire Smith, some other guys. Elio Kobo is another one I've done. Those ones take a little bit longer because I really want to make sure I familiarize myself with all the aspects of their game. And if I'm doing a full profile, I want to do that. Whereas this one, it was more focusing on some specific areas of his game that I wanted to address, where like not a full profile necessarily. So this one didn't take as much time because obviously I've seen plenty of Mikal Bridges over the course of the season. I didn't have to go back and teach myself what his entire game was, but then it was going back and finding things that I was looking for in his tape and seeing, if these things I was thinking about, are they legit? Do they show up on tape, or is it more of a am I making reach? And I think a lot of the stuff that I was in the piece, I think was backed up by the tape. All of it was backed up by the tape. I think I did a good job of using the tape to back up whatever the points I was making.
So you mentioned 8 four-year college players: Buddy Hield, Chris Dunn, Frank, CJ, Damian, Jemmer, Wesley, and Epiudo. And on that list, the only guy that we can honestly say wasn't a productive player was Jimmer Fredette. The rest are pretty productive, and about 2 of them are stars in this league. Does it matter if you're a team in the top 10 looking at Mikal Bridges, looking at his age, and wondering if he's worth the top 10 pick? Because obviously your title was, is he worth the top 10 pick? Having this information, how much of an impact does his age come into play?
I think the age comes into play more specifically with regards to him, including those other players, was just kind of to introduce the idea of sort of bring it to the forefront of your mind that when you're drafting Mikal Bridges, you're drafting a guy who's a senior effectively. He's a redshirt junior, but he's spent 4 years at Villanova. And as I mentioned in the article, he's young for a senior. He doesn't turn 22 until August, but he's still an older prospect. So you do have to consider that. That was mainly the idea. I think that, some of those guys, he's better prospects than for sure coming out, like a Frank Kaminsky, who just doesn't really have that projectable of a game, for example. But I think with him, the reason that the age comes into play is that a lot of the skill development that he hasn't had, and probably the one single skill that I'd highlight for him is ball handling ability, that he hasn't developed yet to this point, I think is really tough to develop at the age that he's at. That's sort of one of the skills that if you're not developing it at a young age, it's probably not going to come along as you're older. Shooting's kind of the opposite. Guys will have these late career shooting jumps all the time, whereas you rarely see guys go from being as limited with their handle as Bridges is now to being, a really dynamic handler at the next level. Usually that's something that comes along early. So that's one of the big areas I think he'd really need to improve on to potentially project to return top 10 value confidently. So without that, I think it's tough to really say that I think that he could get there due to the age. And yeah, that's really what it comes down to, is just projecting how much he can improve, and just noting that, he's starting to get to the point where his age curve's leveling off in terms of speed of improvement. Those 18 to 20 to 21 years, those are the thickest years of your development. You're going to be developing the fastest during those. And once you get past that, your development sort of slows down, at least on the, gigantic historical trend.
You mentioned a player distribution tool as an incredible resource. Can you educate my audience on what that really means and how that really affects Mikal Bridges' stock in the draft?
Yeah. So on the Stepien, Sean Darenthal, one of the guys who's heading that operation at Stepien, he put together a great tool, the player distribution tool. It's a version of a draft model, basically, where instead of giving you one output for your draft model, he uses a machine learning model to give you 1,500 different distribution outcomes that have been simulated. So it's essentially you're simulating a player's career 1,500 times. For example, picking out his peak seasons by PIPM, a metric that you could read more about on the site. There's some links to it there, but it's essentially intended to measure what's a player's peak going to look like, what's his peak value going to look like based on simulation. So you'll get, instead of, Mikal Bridges will be, X, a guy who's equal to the 100th best player in the league. You'll get, oh, he has a 27% chance of being the 100th best player in the league and a 1% chance of being the 20th best player in the league or whatever. So that sort of distribution can give you an idea of what some potential outcomes are, how likely he is to reach certain outcomes. And then the tool also allows you to compare, right there, him to other prospects. And that was a really intuitive way to sort of illustrate that the numbers, and that's not the only model. I know that there are some other models that are a bit down on him in comparison to some of these other top prospects. So that was a good way to illustrate, I think, that numbers-wise, he is a bit limited.
And you also mentioned Robert Covington and Otto Porter as guys who are similar comps. But as I was telling my photo editor who's next to me right now, E-Man, I was like, well, Mikal, without even, reading your story, he's pretty skinny for a 22-year-old or 21-year-old and a guy who's been in college at least 4 years. And it's similar to Justin Jackson, who we drafted at number 15. I wasn't very convinced on him from the get-go, and they still drafted him at 15 when they could have. A month before all my mock drafts, I kept saying the Kings should have drafted Mitchell at 10. I'm on record saying that. And when they traded 10 for 15 and 20, I kind of knew the direction they were heading in, and they really liked Justin Jackson. But I see a similar game in that regard, a guy who's fundamentally sound but still needs to add on weight. And Justin Jackson isn't the athlete Mikal Bridges is, but still, I still see similarities, and I just don't know if I'm Bloody Divac and my job's on the line, because obviously his job will be on the line this offseason. This is the biggest offseason in Kings history. I don't know if they should go with Mikal at number 7. Do you see any similarities like that with Mikal and Justin?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the athleticism is a place where I would draw a line of separation. I also think that Mikal Bridges probably has a stronger shooting sample over the course of his career than Justin Jackson. Justin Jackson kind of broke out that junior season at UNC after being a bit of an iffy shooter throughout his career. And then the big difference on defense would just be the team defense instincts that Mikal Bridges has, which are really impressive. That's something I mentioned in the piece, is just his instincts for getting steals and creating events, that sort of thing is all really impressive. But I think at the baseline level, there are some similarities to a guy like Justin Jackson. That might be an interesting comparison for Bridges as like a supercharged version of Justin Jackson, however valuable that is, but because there are those similar physical limitations. And this is something I've been quibbling with people on Twitter all day about is, how strong can Mikal Bridges get? How strong were Otto Porter and Covington, the two comps I mentioned in the article? What did they look like at his same age? How have they been able to add strength? And I think that Bridges can add a reasonable amount of strength. Even a guy like Justin Jackson still has time to do that. Guys are always still growing into their bodies, even at age 23, 24 as they continue to get older. But I think that the sort of ceiling that you want to see is it from a really switchable guy who could defend the bigger combo forwards in the league. I have a tough time envisioning Bridges adding the level of strength to get to that sort of peak.
Yeah, and that was your biggest argument, right? With Robert Covington being able to, at times, switch onto a guy like Big Al and being able to guard those bigger guys. And I just don't see a place in the league where Mikal will be able to play the 4 position, where I see a guy like Miles Bridges, who is athletic enough to play the 3, but I think the 4 would suit him better. But see, that's a guy who is a lot more versatile and fits more of a need for the Kings. But I also see Mikal playing the 2 and being able to guard some 1s. But with that said, when I was looking at your film, you mentioned some guys from Notre Dame and some other guys who are not NBA prospects just blowing by him. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was something. I think that his reputation, that's probably the one place where I mentioned throughout the article that some of the narratives around his game are kind of outsized what we've actually seen on tape. But I think that was the one spot really where the difference between his reputation and what he actually is the most overstated in terms of his quick twitch ability on the ball. I think that he definitely gets beat quite a bit from a standstill. And no prospect doesn't get beat. Every prospect gets beat on the ball.
Right.
But I think when you're projecting a guy to be like when you're comparing him to on Otto Porter or Robert Covington, who are two of the best defenders at their position in the entire league, I think taking a guy who has so many flaws executing on the ball like that is a bit of a stretch there, especially when you're considering that so much of his value is going to be derived, so much of defensive value in the NBA is derived through switchability. And if he's going to get blown by these guards, and he's not big enough to guard fours, is he just a 2-3 defender? He can be a good 2-3 defender for sure, but there's a little bit of a cap on his upside if he's not going to be a consistent 1-4 switch guy.
So again, guys, everyone can go out and check this story out. It's an exceptional story, which was released today. One last thing on this story. Again, just I wanted to answer the question. Is he a top 10 pick? And if you're the Sacramento Kings, knowing what you know, knowing the pieces that they do have in place, would you take a risk with Mikal at number 7?
I would not. I don't think he's a top 10 pick with the guys that have currently declared for the draft. I have a group of 10 or 11 guys that I'm pretty confident are my top 10 or 11 at this point, and he just doesn't crack. I mean, I think that in some drafts he could potentially be towards the back end of that, but this is a really strong class. And if you're the Sacramento Kings, I think you have to set your sights higher than a guy who, I mean, just doesn't really project to bring that sort of star level upside. I think there are some people who still view him as a potential RPM star in the mold of Covington or Porter, but I just don't see. I think he's too limited offensively outside of shooting, even though he could be dynamic there. And then defensively, the switchability just isn't there in the way you'd want it to be for a guy who's going to be a real franchise defensive sort of player. So I think there are some other guys that I would go with before. For the Kings, it would really depend on how much you value the bigs you already have versus the bigs in this class. Do you want to commit to a Wendell Carter when you have some of these other guys on your squad? But that's a different discussion.
Before we get into your top 10 on your big board, talk to me a little bit about Miles Bridges and some of his strengths and weaknesses. And do you feel like he would be a better fit with the Kings?
That's difficult because you mentioned Bridges playing the 4, and he definitely has the necessary strength baseline to do that. Mm-hmm. One thing that concerns me a lot about Miles Bridges, probably my number one weakness for him, would be just the lack of length. His wingspan is just short of 6'9", I think. It stands at 6'6", which is getting pretty small playing the 4 in the NBA. Some people will compare him to a guy like Draymond Green defensively, but Draymond Green's got like a 7'1", 7'2" wingspan, and Bridges is way far off from that, and that's a huge component of his defensive projection. But I do think the athleticism, the handle's a big thing I talked about with Mikal Bridges. Miles Bridges is way far ahead of him in terms of being able to handle the ball in the half court, and I think some of the passing vision and execution he's shown is ahead of Mikal Bridges as well. And his shooting really jumped this year as well. Like Mikal Bridges, he's an elite free throw shooter. His percentages from 3 dropped a little bit, but he shot like around 90% from the line this season, that's just about all you could ask for. With regards to the Kings, I think Miles Bridges would definitely be a better fit than Mikal Bridges just because of the star upside he brings with his athleticism and ability to handle. I'm not necessarily betting on him to be a star, but in comparison to Mikal Bridges, I'd be more confident.
Does Miles Bridges crack your top 10?
Miles Bridges, I think either 10th or 11th. He's in that group of guys though for me where I got him 10th, yeah. So he's right at the back end of my top 10. But he's right in that group of guys where I think that they'd be worth a pick there.
So what's his biggest strength?
For him, it's just got to be the intersection of athleticism and build, ability to put on the floor and shooting. Not a lot of guys combine those sorts of things. Coming into the league at 230 pounds on the wing is obviously going to be really coveted, but especially when you're a guy who can shoot as well as he can, who can put the ball on the floor like he can. Just that combination of skills is really impressive, and I like to see that. Defensively, I think that he's maybe an average defender. I think that a lot of times athletic guys can be a little bit overrated on D. I think that his length's going to limit him. I don't think he has outstanding instincts by any means, but he's got pop around the rim as a secondary rim protector. So he could be, I'm definitely higher on his offense than his defense, but he could be potentially dynamic on both ends.
Someone on the live chat just commented, and they want to ask you if the Knicks should draft Mikal Bridges if he's available there.
Which pick are they at? The Knicks, is it 8 for them?
I believe so. They're a top 10, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, if I were the Knicks, I'd be looking other directions. I think that they're in sort of a difficult position with the personnel that they have, given that Frank Ntilikina, do you have another point guard to put next to him? I think if Trae Young's there, he'd be an excellent fit next to Frank Ntilikina. So that'd be a guy I'd rather have for sure than Mikal Bridges. But at the big man spot, I mean, do you grab another center when you have Porzingis and Cantor? How do you fit that next to Porzingis? How do you account for that? So with the big situation, I think it's a little bit different. But if you're looking at guards or wings, definitely I'd take Trae Young. Zaire Smith's another guy I definitely look at. I don't know. He's a guy who I'm much higher on than just about anyone else. So I don't know. I would doubt he goes top 8 in real life. But for me, I see him as like a top 8, top 6 prospect in this class. So he's someone who's really impressive to me. And I think that he'd be worth a pick there.
So is he your Donovan Mitchell for 2018?
I don't think he's going to have the immediate impact of a Donovan Mitchell, but if I'm picking a guy in this class to surprise people and turn into a star, it would be Zaire Smith, definitely.
Wow. Bold right there. Talking about a guy, you like him. I like Troy Brown. I just did a breakdown on him. Tell me what you know about him and what you like, what his strengths are, what his weaknesses are. Do you think he has a chance to potentially crack a top 13 pick in 2018?
I'm a huge Troy Brown fan. Before this season, I had Troy Brown ranked 7th on my preseason board, and I predicted he would go in the top 5 of the draft. And for his season didn't exactly play out to that level, but I've always been really in on him. That was the first piece I wrote at the Stepien, was a breakdown of Troy Brown's game. I moved him up. I had him 21st on a big board update I did last week, but I moved him up to 14 today after just reconsidering. He's a guy who I've just been kind of wishy-washy on. Some days I'm like, this guy should be a top 10 pick, and other days I'm not so sure why I'm so high on him. He does have his struggles because he's one of those players.
Like, why aren't you so sure? I mean, what makes you wishy-washy about him?
I think just sometimes when you watch him, he leaves you wanting more because his offense, at least last year at Oregon, his scoring was pretty much fully dependent on hitting jump shots. And when he wasn't hitting jump shots, he kind of fade away from the games. He's not the quickest guy off the bounce. And so he's not great at getting the lane. He didn't score all that much. He's one of the lowest per minute scores in my prospect rankings, top 100, and in most people's probably top 30, top 50, whatever. He just, didn't put the ball in that basket that much, but I love his feel for the game. He can pass. He's long. He's strong. He's going to be switchable on defense. He's one of the youngest players in this class. I think if the jumper comes around, he's a definite, solid, useful rotation player, starter type of guy in the NBA. And I think the best avenue for Troy Brown is playing the 4 in the NBA. I think he's most useful as an advantage playmaking 4.
Really? I had him as a 3, but do you think he's strong enough and big enough to play the 4?
Yeah, I think that, with some time and adding, 15, 20 pounds to his frame, he could definitely do that, especially with how much the NBA is downsizing at this point. I think that he can play some 3 in the NBA. I think that that's a fine role for him, but I think he could also be devastating as like a small ball 4 type of guy.
So in that similar type of like a Draymond Green, even like a Miles Bridges, is he close to like a Miles Bridges?
Yeah, I think that the Draymond Green comparison is one that I think is potential for him. He's smaller than Green is, but I think that as like a guy who's an elite playmaker, just a rebounder, cerebral player, he has some upside to be in that mold. Not that he's going to reach the magnitude of Draymond Green, or obviously, but I think that he could fit that sort of similar playmaking mold.
Right on. So, who are in your top 10 as of right now?
So I just threw together a big board update. I've been working on that today. Just not a giant one from the last one I did, but just some tweaks. Top 10 for me: number 1, Luka Doncic; number 2, Jaren Jackson Jr.; number 3, Trae Young; number 4, DeAndre Ayton; number 5, Marvin Bagley; number 6, Zaire Smith; number 7, Wendell Carter; number 8, Jonte Porter; number 9, Mohamed Bamba; and number 10, Miles Bridges. And if you're wondering where Michael Porter is, he's 11th for me. So I'm not dropping him that far, but I do have him number 11.
Brother over him, huh?
yeah. I'm going all in on the Jonte train right now.
What do you like about Jonte?
Just the elite cerebral play, ability to put on the floor, shooting from distance. I think that what we've seen in recent years is that a lot of big man defenders have come into the league underrated on that end because they're so cerebrally elite. I think Nikola Jokic is an example of this. People wonder, how's this guy good on defense? He can't jump over a phone book, that sort of thing. But a lot of time you can see just the ability to be cerebral on offense translate in some defensive impact. And I think Porter's a guy who that applies to. And he's the youngest prospect in the draft. He doesn't turn 19 until November. I think he has some potential to improve his body. But I'm really going to be interested in how his wingspan measures out at the combine, because that's going to be a huge component of his rim protection projection. But you look at guys like Kelly Olynyk, who looked useful in the playoffs. He could be like a supercharged version of Kelly Olynyk, potentially a little bit smaller, but a little bit more dynamic and smarter on defense, I think.
Before we move on to Luka Doncic, I want to let the audience know that this episode of the CK Podcast is presented by POWERHANDZ. So do us a favor, everybody. Go out, grab yourself a pair of gloves, and get your handles right. I know I got my handles right. I've been balling lately, and I appreciate POWERHANDZ for that. Luka Doncic, my man, he pretty much said he's not working out for NBA teams today. Will that hurt him, or will that give him a better chance to slide to the Kings?
um, I think teams know who he is at this point. He's been in the scouting limelight for years now, ever since he was 13, 14, dominating FIBA tournaments. I think one U14 tournament in the championship game, he put up like 52, 13, and 13 or something. So he's been dominating forever. Teams know who he is by now. I think the one thing teams would want to know are some of his measurements, the exact height, wingspan, standing reach measurements, because honestly, I think he has a chance to measure out at like 6'9" in shoes if he were to measure out. You look at some of the photos of him next to some of these guys that have been measured out at like 6'9", and he looks just as tall as them. And I think that could definitely increase his stock a little bit if he measured out taller than expected, which I think that he would. But other than that, I think, teams have a general feel for who he is. And it's not like he's not working out because of something weird. He's going to be playing. He's going to be competing. I think that you have to have some appreciation for that he's going to be with his team, trying to help them win a championship, because he's one of the best players in the Europe at age 19. That's pretty impressive.
I also have Luka and Jaren Jackson on my big board as number 1 and 2. Now, that necessarily doesn't mean that they're going to go 1 and 2, because the recreational fan is infatuated with DeAndre Ayton going number 1, right? Mm-hmm. And when I have my conversations with my photo editor, he's a big DeAndre Ayton fan, and we've had a lot of discussions about Ayton versus Jackson. Is it crazy to think that I believe JJ has more upside and has a better shot to be the best big man in this draft?
Absolutely not. I'm all in on Jaren Jackson Jr. I've considered right now, the way I have my big board, I have Luka Doncic in tier 1, just him, then Jaren Jackson in tier 2, just him, onto some tiers after that. But I've considered moving Jaren Jackson into the same tier as Luka Doncic, just because his defense is absolutely unbelievable. The mobility, the way he can cover ground quickly, his instincts, he just knows how to play so much. And then on offense, the jump shot is the best of all the bigs in this class. And on top of that, he's flashed some face-up growth. And Mike Ribbenov actually wrote a great piece at The Stepien about this. The concerns about his finishing are a little bit overblown, because he was used in a lot of different roles as some of the other big men. His percentages look bad, but once you suss out why they look bad, it's because he's asked to finish in some lower efficiency situations, whereas guys like DeAndre and Marvin Bagley are going to be used as role man, offensive rebounders, much more often, so they're getting higher percentage looks at the rim. I don't think his pop or explosiveness around the rim is necessarily a strength, especially compared to a guy like Ayton, but it's a bit overstated as a weakness.
So is his 40% three-point shooting, is that sustainable at the NBA level?
I think there's definitely some reason to bring skepticism to the shot, especially just because the form is a little weird. But I have a lot of things that I do like about his jump shot. I like his footwork, getting into it out of the pick and pop, especially. He catches in the shooting pocket and he doesn't bring it down. Talking about Troy Brown, that's probably one of my least favorite parts of his game, is that he brings the ball down whenever he catches instead of releasing straight from the shooting pocket. But Jaren Jackson Jr., dating back to his high school days, he's been a 40% 3-point shooter. This wasn't a random sample for him, and he shot 80% from the free throw line. So all of that inspires confidence. And then the weird mechanics are a bit of a hang up for me, but at the same time, he shoots such a high arcing shot that I think that it should translate to the NBA line fairly well. But any sort of prospect warrants skepticism around their jump shot if that's what you're building their offensive projection about, just because it's so difficult to tell how well that's going to translate.
So would you say DeAndre Ayton's jump shot's a little bit weird as well?
Yeah, I think his footwork is definitely strange, and the fact that he shoots a flat ball is a question, because he kind of goes straight at the rim a little bit sometimes. That could have some issues translating to the NBA line, and his footwork is really inconsistent. He brings his feet close together a lot of the time, which doesn't allow him to get as much knee bend, and you'll see some flat shots then. When his shot looks the best is when he keeps his feet far apart, gets some more knee bend. He can get some more arc on that shot. But I think his shot projects well. I think he'll be, a solid threat from 3 in time, but I would definitely place Jackson above him there.
I get kind of upset when people try to tell me that Bamba and Aiden are better defenders than Jaren Jackson. And I'm like, well, no. What do you say to those people?
I think you have to look closely at the film, and specifically space defense and team defense, because if you're just looking at compilations of blocks, you're not going to be able to tell who's the process behind those blocks. How's he getting into position for that? That sort of thing. And Jaren Jackson Jr., Mohamed Bamba is known as a great shot blocker. He's got the 7'9" wingspan. Jaren Jackson Jr. had a higher block percentage than Mo Bamba. He was, a better per minute shot blocker, per possession shot blocker than Mo Bamba was. And then you look at those 3 guys defending in space. I mean, it's just really different for each of them, because Ayton can, face up and guard guys on the perimeter pretty well when he's locked in on the ball. But the difference between him and Jackson in terms of off-ball reactions, probably there couldn't be 2 prospects more different, 2 skills in terms of ability to react to actions off the ball. And then Bamba just doesn't have that same fluidity moving in space. And I think his reactions they're not terrible, but they're definitely behind Jackson just because he's so elite in that regard. So he has like the holy trinity of defensive skills, basically the rim protection, the on-ball defense on the perimeter, and then the off-ball reactions. There's really not much more you could ask from him other than being as big as Mo Bamba and then maintaining the skills that he still has.
Well, that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much, Jackson, for spending some time with us. Again, guys, the audio version will be available on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn Radio later tonight. Where can people find your work, brother, and where can they follow you on social media?
I'm always writing stuff up at the Stepien. I write for Log Draft as well. Host the Harvard Homies NBA Draft Podcast on iTunes. And follow me on Twitter at JHoyNBA. Always tweeting, always happy to engage in discussion. If you want to talk about my piece, I've had plenty of people asking me questions, giving their quibble. So, come hit me if you want to discuss that.
There it is, guys. We're going to have to get you back on as a regular, brother. I loved your analysis, your knowledge of the game, and your knowledge of these prospects. Thank you so much, and I'll be in contact with you.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. I really appreciate it.